All right, I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about childhood sexual abuse and the implications on development as well as resulting personalities and relationships in adulthood. Sexual development, as we've been discussing in class, is obviously more than just sex, but rather one's values, attitudes, feelings, the way we interact with others, as well as sexual behaviors. The most common theories of sexual development involve developmental stages in which individuals progress through different stages of development. And the most common theorist with the developmental stages are Freud's psychosexual stages, as well as Erik Erikson's got some stages that he's addressed, as well as Jean Piaget. All of these theorists y'all are probably familiar with. So I'm not going to go into detail regarding those theories. However, as individuals do progress through these stages, that's where sexual maturity happens. And so for adolescents who have normal sexual development, who have not had any issues with sexual abuse, then they begin to develop through these stages and they perceive sexual activities as expressions of closeness, of sensuality, respect, responsibility, as well as concern for not only their self but also for their partner. Oh, and I do need to note that as well as progressing through these stages, there are influences that influence our development, and that includes the parental involvement or lack of involvement, peers, media, and society. Okay, so for those who have derailed sexual development, these are children who have experienced some sort of sexual abuse. And under the developmental stages theory, these children experience sexual stimulation for which they are developmentally unprepared. And that disrupts their normal sequence of sexual development and forces them into later stages that they're not prepared for. With the stages development, you have to progress through stage 1 to get to stage 2 and through stage 2 to get to stage 3. So if you jump into stage 3 without resolving 1 and 2, then that could lead to problems for that child being not mature enough to progress to that stage yet. And so in giving that, if they do experience sexual stimulation that they were not prepared for, then that often does lead to problems for that individual, conflicts, crisis within the self and within society. All right, and then some theories here these are theories following abuse. I'm just going to touch on these two. I'm not going to go into detail on these two, but I thought they were applicable. The compensation theory just simply states that sexual dysfunctions of victims of child sexual abuse are maladaptive behaviors in an attempt to compensate for some sort of distortion that's internalized as a consequence of sexual exploitation. This compensation could be some behavioral dysfunctions in the way that they experience sex, or in their relationships. They may try to compensate to feel better about themselves. And then the social learning theory, that has to do with sexualized behaviors as a result of poor impulse control or lack of inhibition in abused children. And this is the result of social learning, where the victim, which is the child, typically learns from the perpetrator to act in a sexual way, or that the abused child has internalized that they are bad, unworthy, or damaged, which leads to basically learned behaviors as the primary way of acquiring emotional support. So possibly for an individual who is sexually abused by a parent, where they think that might be the only way that they can receive love from somebody else, then that may be a learned behavior where as a teen they may develop into having relationships with others, being more sexually open and promiscuous because they believe that is the way that they show love or receive love from others. All right, and like I said earlier, the influences on development include the parental role, peers, media, society. The parental role is extremely important, as parents do play a role in either providing safeguards for their kids to progress through those stages appropriately, where they're not exposed to things too early, as well as freedom to be able to express their sexuality. There's got to be a level of balance there. Somewhere meeting in the middle ground between safeguards and being protected from those kinds of things, as well as being allowed to developmentally appropriately express their sexuality. Okay, so now getting into the theories following sexual abuse. The traumatic sexualization theory, by Finkelhor and Brown, I believe is how you say those. They suggest that it's a process in which a child's sexuality is shaped in developmentally inappropriate and interpersonally dysfunctional ways. It has 4 dynamics. Under this one, the traumatic sexualization, betrayal, powerlessness, and the stigmatization the theory here is that you can utilize these 4 dynamics to conceptualize with your clients regarding each category there, each dynamic. How the level to which they are traumatized, the level of betrayal, as well as powerlessness and the stigmatization. And we're going to go further into that later in this presentation. However, what Finkelhor and Brown did suggest is that the development is shaped not only just by the abuse, but the child's adjustment before the abuse, as well as the way that others responded following disclosure of the abuse. So adjustment before an abuse, so well-adjusted child whose parents are loving and caring, and then they experience some sort of sexual abuse, may be better adjusted to cope with that following the abuse, as opposed to like a child whose mother just remarried and then didn't like stepfather, and the stepfather is the perpetrator, and this child was already having issues with various family related things. So that child may not be as well adjusted, which might make the impact of the abuse more difficult to cope with. That's kind of the idea there. Okay, so traumatic sexualization. The idea here is that the amount of traumatizing from the events, the level at which the child is traumatized. And we assess this. We can, ask our clients questions about, how much they were enticed to participate, or if they were forced to participate in the sexual behavior. That can play a role in how traumatizing it is. Inappropriate repertoires of sexual behavior with confusion and misconceptions about their sexual self-concepts, and with unusual emotions associated to sexual activity. That often occurs following the abuse. And I listed some resulting symptoms because these are going to be some of the things that you'll see when your clients come in and present with various issues. So inappropriate sexual behaviors. If you're treating kids, you may see early inappropriate behaviors or gestures, confusions or misconceptions about their own sexuality or their sexual self-concept, confusions about what is normal as far as exhibiting sexual behaviors, misunderstandings about sex or affection, like I discussed earlier with how do we obtain love from others, and what does that mean, and how do we get affection, and negative connotations or even aversions to sex. And we see that pretty often as well in the therapeutic arena, where individuals may sort of reject sexual behaviors, or they have issues later in life in relationships with their husband or their wife, and then they can't perform, or it's real triggery for them, and they have distress when sex comes up. Unusual emotions associated with sex, kind of the same idea, obsessions or preoccupations with sex, and this may be where some of that pornographic issues come into play. or other preoccupations like repeated masturbation, which is that next one there. Flashbacks are very common as well. And a lot of times that can happen, within the marriage, that they have flashbacks to the abuse, which then affects the intimate relationship within the marriage. Could be anxiety, or just sexual dysfunctions in general. All right, and then the betrayal dynamic here. This is the discovery that someone on whom they were vitally dependent has caused them harm. So those are going to be the ones that they experience a higher level of betrayal than somebody who is abused by maybe a neighbor or somebody that they didn't know as well, or a stranger, as opposed to a child who is abused by a caregiver or a parent. And from the research, those individuals that are abused by a biological father have the highest levels of stigmatization, sexualization, traumatic sexualization, and betrayal, because that's the individual who is supposed to protect you and provide you with what you need to be healthy and to be happy. And when that person violates you, you certainly feel betrayal. You can also, they also feel betrayal oftentimes not only by the abuser themselves, but after reporting the abuse, if the response from others, is disbelief or blame, or they're ostracized from it, that also can play a role in that level of betrayal that they feel. So, for example, we'll say a young lady is abused, a child, by her father, or we'll say stepfather, and then she does tell mother about what's going on, and mother doesn't believe her. So now she's not only been betrayed by the stepfather, who's supposed to be a caregiver, but as well as the mother, who didn't protect her and didn't believe her. And the powerlessness dynamic here. This involves the process in which a child's will, desire, and sense of efficacy are continually contravened. The child's territory and body space are invaded against the child's will, which can make the child feel powerless. They may be manipulated into engaging sexually with the abuser. And the powerlessness can also come into play when they've tried to stop it, and when we're not able to do so. That too can make the child feel powerless. So the level of powerlessness varies. The degree to which that individual experienced that is the idea here, or what you are trying to assess with your clients. Powerlessness is increased when the child experiences fear. They're afraid. The child is unable to make adults understand or believe what's happening, like we talked about in the betrayal. It certainly can lead to a child feeling like they don't have any kind of control, and nobody can help them. The child realizes how conditions of dependency have trapped them in the situation, because a lot of times if the abuse is by a caregiver, then they are trapped, that there's no one there to rescue them, or maybe there are consequences for the disclosure. And that has happened in numerous times as well, that the child may even be removed from the home if there's abuse in the home, and placed in DHS custody or something like that. And that essentially is consequences for the child. All right, and the last dynamic here was the stigmatization, the negative connotations that I'm bad, or they have any kind of shame or guilt that are communicated to the child around the experience, and then become incorporated into the child's own self-image. And this can come from society, from peers, from parents, from the abuser. The abuser may blame the victim, demean the victim, causing some sort of shame, or even pressure the victim to secrecy. From the family, they reinforce these attitudes in the victim, oftentimes blaming the victim too. And I had a similar incident with this one. I worked with some kids from a local high school where a young lady was abused, and the family